Hey everybody, thank you for joining today. Hey, today I went a little bit darker because I know that we had talked about, dark psychology and things like that, predatory nature, predatory behavior. So today I decided to do a video on something that I think is kind of an underrated, psychiatric problem, condition, and I'm talking about sexual sadism. Of course, we all know, the infamous, Ted Bundy, which, I'll get to later. But he was a primary one. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it, okay? So what is sexual sadism? Sexual sadism disorder is, it's one of several psychiatric, sexual disorders that it's categorized by a paraphilic nature, which in turn is you have intense, sexual gratification and arousal and desires and fantasies and urges that are typically, outside of the norm. Really, and the main thing too, we also have to notice about this as well, is that sexual sadism is only classified as a disorder if those urges and fantasies are acted upon. So once the, individual has crossed that threshold from fantasy to reality to actually acting, upon these things, then it becomes a problem. So, and I think that's something that really needs to be discussed. Okay, and another thing, basically it becomes a disorder because it's such a way that these individuals have where they become so aroused by these urges and fantasies with respect to the main aspect that they intend to cause physical an emotional harm, the distress and inflicting of that pain to oneself and or another, primarily without consent. But technically, can go either way. Sexual sadism is basically causing pain, humiliation, fear, degradation, mental, harm, physical harm, that sort of thing. Some examples kind of this, I know everybody knows 50 Shades of Grey, but I'm talking more in the sense like, maybe handcuffs, like, you didn't see that coming, kind of like Bundy style. I'm talking, ropes biting. I'm talking, beating, choking. I mean, just like, more than, some people like, but, more than a little bit of that, but to a point where it's kind of like, you take a step back because that's not really fun for somebody anymore, especially, when their health and, they're physically feeling these things, in a non-pleasurable way. So it may cause the sexual gratification, the pleasure to the individual, the sadist, but not to his victim. But that's what they like. That's the sex to them. That intentional infliction of pain and harm and hurt is the sex to them. That's what gratifies them. It's not the sex itself. Okay, so, we might need to remember that. But basically, with or without harm, like I said, or without harm to another, if it's in like a willing act, or somebody wants to act out, some 50 Shades, maybe, a little bit, more intense, that's not considered a disorder, that's just some kinky individuals, but hey, teach their own. But repeated acts without consent, that does harm another person, this becomes a problem, and this is classified as part of the disorder. It's actually a huge part of the disorder. We also have to remember too that in regards to this, for it to be classified, obviously it's severe, but into the more, severe type is when the perpetrator, the sadist, has done these things to his victims at least 3 or more times without consent. So it's kind of like a serial sadist, serial killers, 3 or more, victims without a cooling off period. Well, that's kind of like a sadist, 3 or more victims, without consent, with no cooling off period. Okay, basically, the kind of messed up thing here about this too is that diagnosis for sexual sadist actually comes later than it really does sooner, and a lot of times people say, oh, well, there should be red flags, so on and so forth. Well, not always. Okay, and the problem with this is it doesn't, these sexual sadists are not diagnosed until, well, they have to cross that line from fantasy into reality to actually physically acting on these, sexual urges, fantasies, etc. Once they do that and they cross that threshold, they've crossed the point of no return. So it kind of gets, escalates, and it gets more violent and, more hurtful, more harm, until some point, I don't want to relay this, but kind of like Bundy, it can, eventually propel into murder. And I don't know about you, but I don't think murder would be a good part of sex. But moving forward, okay. And often an extreme sexual sadist. The problem with this here too is that like I was saying, it can become criminal. To the point where you are intentionally causing harm or serious bodily injury to another, especially without consent, and even to the point of death. And I don't think that somebody wants to be with someone and they consider that the last time they're gonna be alive, and oh, we're gonna have sex, and then just like you don't come out of it. Like, that's kind of messed up. But basically during this point, there is significant impairment, and it causes distress and dysfunction in day-to-day activities. Once that threshold is crossed and they're into the active, actually physically doing these things, it does cause distress and, dysfunction. And like I said, Bundy was that way. I mean, that was the sex to him. Like, he would these are highly premeditated because they're fantasized and they're urges. And, these people, it's one thing to have it up here, but it's quite another to act out on it, and it comes to the point where the problem with sexual sadists is that eventually they objectify their victims. Their victims are no longer people, okay? They are objects. They are things. And we had discussed that well, in an earlier video, and that's really messed up. I mean, so you can just kind of place yourself in there and imagine that kind of mentality. Like, what are these women thinking? You know what I mean? If you have someone, oh, he's such a nice guy, and then all of a sudden, like, he turns into this kind of, I like to say, the monster, like a Jack in the Box. Well, it's a monster in a box. That's the analogy I like to use. And I don't think anybody would really like that, not have to worry about life or death, at least not me. Okay, so what are some symptoms of, sexual sadism? Well, okay, basically, they must have a persistent and intense sexual arousal, gratification from physical and or mental abuse, intentionally inflicting harm on another. That's what's gratifying to them. Okay, so that's a big thing. And a big tip here too, as I stated before, this is with or without a person's consent. So if this is something that, is ongoing, that might be a red flag. But basically these symptoms, even if they're urges, and at this point, even if you haven't, the individual has not acted out upon them yet, the fact that these urges, or fantasies or impulses, they have to be present for at least 6 months. And they have to cause some type, like I was saying, impairment or distress. Some kind of wrench thrown in everyday, day-to-day activities in life. And it's one thing, to kind of play around, but it is quite another when these signs become kind of apparent, and then, you always kind of have that feeling. You're kind of just like, maybe something's a little off about the person, but you just kind of ignore it. With something like this, I wouldn't ignore. And the problem with this is, with sexual sadists, most of the time, these individuals are not just classified as a sexual sadist. There is usually some kind of underlying, a mental illness or a personality disorder or a mood disorder or, something to that effect. And especially if sexual sadism is accompanied with a personality disorder, such as, antisocial traits, things like that, grandiose narcissism, hedonistic, behavior like Bundy, that becomes a problem, because it becomes one of the most dangerous, extremely dangerous, especially when coupled with other psychiatric conditions. And this makes it very, very difficult to diagnose and very, very difficult to treat, because you have to understand that these people, especially, the narcissists and sociopaths, if they are pathologically lying, they have nothing but time in their minds. They can think of lies on a whim, and as a matter of fact, probably 95% of the things they're telling you is not true. So what do you believe? You can cover a lie with a lie, but how do you really know, what the truth is? I mean, in that case, nobody knew who Bundy really was, doing all these things to these women for years. I'm just saying, although he did make a good point. He said, yeah, you can get rid of him, but really, this is still a problem. You're going to wake up tomorrow and, there's still going to be serial killers out, and people are still going to be dying, from, whatever sexual sadist, so on and so forth. And it is a problem. So I think that, maybe this is something that kind of should, if we could kind of nip it in the bud, maybe protect each other or our children or, whomever, just get the word out there. Some causes to this, basically, they're relatively unknown. There are theories, including escapism, which is where, a general person that has a feeling of powerlessness, in every day to day, once they can overcome and overpower their victim with the sexual gratification of inflicting that pain and harm, they escape their mind. They escape that mentality. There's also it's a release of suppressed sexual fantasies, and this kind of always start kind of off with, maybe you have something, a little bit sexual, and then maybe you kind of go into like something a little hardcore, a little more hardcore, and then it kind of escalates into something maybe a little more kind of violent, hardcore, and then it kind of, it just spawns from there. But basically it's a little bit darker, than a normal fantasy or urge, and this is repressed. Like I said, this is something that has been escalating over time. This is not something that these individuals have thought of overnight. Basically another one as well, only that they are acted upon, so that's something we need to keep in mind as well. Abuse in early childhood is also another theory, and with this I did a little more research, and I'm gonna couple this and say that physical and sexual abuse is a huge problem, or that I believe spawns especially sexual sadists. You have to think about it. If there is violence, domestic violence incorporated in the home, or the child is abused or even sexually abused, in any kind of manner, but even in a violent manner, they tend to escape their own reality. So what happens is their psyche fractures. Okay. And so what they do is they have to repress these memories, like we had just talked about, and from childhood. So this is something that has been going on many, many, many years. Basically, it's in the subconscious, the id, which we had discussed, the shadow archetype hewn. Usually this is done by a caregiver, but it could be, this abuse could be from anyone, that sort of thing. It's always like a monster brewing. You never know when it's going to come out, and it is sad. Okay, but treatments, etc. It is very uncommon for sexual sadists to seek out treatment. Generally, what will happen is these individuals will commit a crime, and during that time, that's when the treatment may occur, but it's usually only when the crime is related to something sexual or, pedophilic in nature, or violent sexual in nature. And if the crime is related, by law, they are required to seek help. And, whether that be a psychiatric eval, a referral, so on and so forth. Basically, the professional help they get, it's not an ends to a means. It's more or less just to suppress the urges. These people cannot be cured. They cannot be cured. They can only, their actions and behaviors can only be slowed. Okay. Psychotherapy usually works, along with, medication, antidepressants, maybe something like, something with a mood stabilizer as well. So maybe Abilify and, Prozac, maybe, Tegretol, Depakote, another mood stabilizer as well. And so what this does is this evens out the chemicals inside the brain, the serotonin, the dopamine, the norepinephrine, and so what this does is it reduces behaviors, but it does not stop them. Okay. And also what this helps to do is it lowers their sexual drive, and especially those that do have the personality disorders alongside, with other psychiatric disorders, especially during a time of a psychotic episode. That does help. And also cognitive behavioral therapy is also, it's another route you can go just to sort of suppress, these behaviors, but ultimately they will not end. And cognitive behavioral therapy is where the individual is trained to look and recognize these patterns, these unhealthy, these sexual patterns and sexual thoughts, and replace them with healthy alternatives. Okay. Basically it's just cognitive reconstructing. You're relearning how to train your thought pattern. Okay. You're identifying and overcoming what the problem is in your mind, your distorted thought patterns, and really that's about it. That's the best that they can do, but overall, anybody, pedophilic, sexual sadists, masochisms, anything like that, that's a little more violent, just cross your fingers, I guess, and hope, and these people can't be helped. I wish they could, but unfortunately they can't. So once again, as always, thank you guys for joining me, and join me tomorrow. I'm going to have a great discussion then, okay? Bye.